Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here today to present to you the report of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Our report sheds light on the importance of measuring the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So let me start by going back a few years in history. The year 2011 marked a turning point in our field of business and human rights. That year, the member states of the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles. The principles also received overwhelming support from the global business community and global civil society. The guiding principles were designed to clarify the roles and responsibilities of companies and states in addressing business-related harm. They function like a blueprint to guide efforts by governments and companies to improve their practices. The Working Group on Business and Human Rights was set up to support the uptake and implementation of these guiding principles. So in other words, to get them off the UN paper and into real-world practice. So we have to ask then, 4 years after their endorsement in the UN, what can we see in terms of real-world implementation? Now, we do have some evidence that progress is being made. More than 24 states have adopted or are in the process of developing their national action plans on business and human rights. National human rights institutions around the world are increasingly taking up cases of business-related harm. Global standards and initiatives relating to responsible business, like the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises and the ISO 26000 standards, have incorporated the guiding principles. And regional organizations such as the OAS, the African Union, ASEAN, the Council of Europe, and the EU have all made declarations or resolutions on the guiding principles. Now, there's something happening outside the government sphere as well. So in the business realm, we can see an increasing number of companies adopting policies on human rights and due diligence practices in line with the guiding principles. Business associations are giving detailed guidance to their members on human rights. And the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, which is under the stewardship of my working group, has become one of the largest UN forums now. We attract about 2,000 participants from government, business, and civil society to Geneva each year to discuss implementation of the UN Guiding Principles. So these are all signs that we are moving away from declaratory commitments to real-world implementation. And yet, despite the proliferation of efforts to implement the guiding principles, we lack systematic, comprehensive data on where we stand and on the progress we've made, and also on the gaps in that progress. Without effective measurement of guiding principles, effective implementation is impossible. So there's an old business saying that goes, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And without reliable information on where and how companies are impacting human rights and what actors are doing to prevent and mitigate the harms, we can't work to ensure that progress is actually moving in the right direction. Now, measurement also incentivizes actors to take action. It allows us to determine whether commitments made by governments and companies to implement the guiding principles are truly being met. Measurement can also give clear direction, a clear set of goalposts to help steer actors to the necessary steps. These are the reasons why measuring guiding principles implementation is a strategic priority for my working group, and why we dedicated the report before you to this topic. Now I'll turn to discuss our main findings in assessing the state of play, or where we stand now with measuring. Mr. Chair, Let me stress at the outset that there is a wealth of potentially relevant data available out there. Existing measurement initiatives represent a range of methodologies, some with an explicit focus on the guiding principles. States, for instance, collect and publish data on the implementation of laws and policies that safeguard labor conditions, human rights, and environmental standards. Companies track the implementation of their sustainability and their corporate social responsibility policies. NGOs and affected communities have their own tools to monitor and report on business impacts. There are also surveys, benchmarking, and ranking initiatives to assess states and companies' commitments and processes. The report before you includes a more detailed assessment of a range of relevant initiatives and how their data gives us crucial information on progress being made in the implementation of the guiding principles. The assessment of existing initiatives, however, reveals a number of gaps where more data and more information is needed. First, despite the wealth of initiatives offering potentially relevant data, that data is generally not collated or presented in a way that enables a clear assessment of guiding principles implementation. For instance, we might have strong data about the effectiveness of courts in a country, but no information as to their specific treatment of cases related to business harm. Second, when looking at it from the perspective of the three pillars of the guiding principles, so Pillar 1 on states, Pillar 2 on business, and Pillar 3 on remedy, a much larger number of initiatives measure company respect for human rights compared to the other two pillars. While some initiatives do attempt to measure state implementation, or Pillar 1, most of these efforts focus on the rule of law or general human rights conditions, rather than specific measures to prevent and address corporate human rights harm. Now, we see even fewer measurement initiatives specific to victims' access to remedy, so Pillar 3 of the guiding principles. While information on access to remedy is available at national and international levels, we lack the data on the number and nature of grievances against companies and the effectiveness of the bodies tasked with remediating those grievances. We also have far more data on the commitments of states and companies than on the actual outcome of these commitments. We know, for example, the number of companies that have a human rights policy, but we don't know to what extent these companies are implementing those policies, nor whether they're having the intended effect on the ground. Lastly, we see some issues being measured more than others. While data on labor rights and environmental impacts is often readily available, we know much less about the rights of communities and the protection of human rights defenders working on business-related harm. Now, Mr. Chair, in response to the gaps identified in the working group's report, we propose a number of strategic entry points to strengthen measurement of the implementation of the guiding principles. First, we need to expand existing vehicles to increase data on state implementation of the guiding principles. National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights, or NAPs, are one such vehicle. In the process of developing a national action plan, governments need to collect information on the main human rights challenges arising from business operations and on their own laws and processes to address them. This data collection process is essential to developing an action plan which truly addresses the key challenges in the country. It also has the added benefit of giving us data and knowledge at the global level on states' actions and the possibilities to carry over good practice examples from one state to the next. Another entry point with respect to states is the use of existing UN human rights mechanisms. Reporting to human rights treaty bodies or under the Universal Periodic Review provides an opportunity for governments to assess the implementation of the guiding principles and for treaty bodies to monitor these efforts and identify good practices and gaps. Second, we must encourage efforts to collect data on companies' implementation of the guiding principles. Most existing initiatives to measure company performance don't refer to human rights exclusively, but they follow a broader framework for assessing the social impacts of companies. These include environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, initiatives by investors, as well as sustainable stock exchange indexes, triple bottom line, or people, planet, and profit-based accounting practices. While most of these efforts include some human rights criteria, they tend to focus on a narrow range of human rights, for examples on workers' rights and customers' rights. So while these initiatives do offer a vehicle for increasing measurement of guiding principles implementation, they must be further developed and extended to include the full scope of human rights. Third, at the global level, the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda provide significant opportunities for increased implementation and measurement of the guiding principles. The working group welcomes the role given to business as a key stakeholder in efforts to meet the global goals. But this role must be matched with equally substantial responsibility. To put it bluntly, we don't want companies building hospitals and health centers to help ensure access to health care, while at the same time undermining their workers' health with unsafe labor conditions or their community's health with unsafe emissions. In our view, the guiding principles must be the first do no harm dictum, which lies at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this must include the measurement effort and the setting up of indicators at global and national level that accompany the SDGs implementation. A fourth and crucial entry point is to work towards global convergence and agreement on how we measure the implementation of the guiding principles. Not only do we lack the data to measure the guiding principles implementation, but we lack the definitions and frameworks for doing so. To work towards developing these frameworks, we need to unpack the guiding principles into measurable elements and come to a consensus on how to determine which areas are showing progress and which are falling behind. Distinguished delegates, my final point is about the risk of measurement and the need for an inclusive process to address that risk. While measurement is often perceived as a neutral technical exercise, it is infused with value choices at its very core. Measuring any complex phenomenon necessarily highlights some areas while de-emphasizing others. As we argue for the need to measure guiding principles implementation, we also argue that we must measure what is meaningful to know, not what is easiest to measure. This is why any measurement effort must spring from an inclusive process, ensuring an appropriate mix of qualitative and quantitative approaches. Any process of measurement should be made with the participation of actors across stakeholder, geographical, and political divides, and should in particular strive to include communities who are directly affected by business operations. It is only by doing so that this measurement effort can spark a race to the top in areas where we need it most. We end our report with concrete recommendations to all actors who have a role to play in improved measurement of the guiding principles implementation. So this comprises states, civil society organizations, and businesses, of course, but also business associations, investors, academics, national human rights institutions, and the UN human rights system. The working group is committed to galvanizing action on the measurement of guiding principles implementation. The UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, which will take place in Geneva from the 16th through the 18th of November